The padlock on the cabin door was rusted shut. I stood there in the dark with 2 suitcases and a flashlight I'd bought at a gas station 40 miles back, and I couldn't even get inside. I sat on the porch steps and listened to the lake. The water lapped against the dock my grandfather built when I was 7. The same dock where he taught me to tie knots and told me that patience wasn't about waiting. It was about knowing what you were waiting for. I didn't understand that then. I'm not sure I understand it now. Before I go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. And if you've ever walked away from everything you built with nothing but what fit in 2 suitcases, hit like and subscribe. Because this story doesn't end where you think it does. 2 weeks earlier, I was sitting on my friend Megan's couch waiting for the hearing that would decide the division of assets. The divorce was already signed. Brandon filed, and I had no way to fight it. But the hearing would determine who got what. Megan had let me stay with her since the day I left the house. She never complained, never made me feel like a burden. But I could hear her on the phone with her boyfriend at night, whispering about how long this would last. I didn't blame her. Her apartment was small. My presence made everything smaller. The day came. Courthouse, 9 in the morning. Brandon's lawyer did most of the talking. Mine, the one I found through a free legal aid website because I couldn't afford anyone else, sat beside me shuffling papers and checking his phone. Brandon sat across the aisle in the suit I'd picked out for him 6 years ago, the charcoal one with the thin pinstripe. He looked good. He always looked good. That was part of the problem. Your Honor, my client has been the sole financial provider for the duration of this marriage, his lawyer said, straightening his tie. The residence, the vehicles, the investment accounts, all acquired through his income and his professional efforts. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to say that when we got married, Brandon was selling insurance out of a rented office with a broken air conditioner, that I worked double shifts at the hospital for 3 years so he could get his broker's license, that when he finally started making real money, he told me I could quit, and I did, because I believed him when he said he'd take care of us. But my lawyer had told me not to speak. He said the judge had already reviewed everything. He said it was straightforward. Straightforward. That was the word he used. The judge awarded Brandon the house, the one I'd chosen, the one where I'd painted every room myself because we couldn't afford a contractor back then. He got both cars. He got the savings account that still had my name on it, but somehow didn't count as mine. He got the retirement fund. He got the life we built together, and I got a settlement check for $11,000 and a handshake from a lawyer who was already late for his next case. When the list of assets reached my grandfather's cabin, the judge reviewed the documents and ruled it stayed with me. Direct inheritance, received before the marriage, never incorporated into marital property. Brandon rolled his eyes. His lawyer shrugged. An old cabin in the middle of nowhere. Nobody cared. I didn't cry in the courtroom. I held it together until I got to the parking lot, and then I sat in the passenger seat of Megan's car and stared at the dashboard until she asked if I wanted to go somewhere. I don't have anywhere to go, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What about your grandfather's cabin? Up by the lake?" It really was the only place I had left. Grandpa Arthur died when I was 31. He left the cabin to me. Just the cabin, nothing else. My mother had rolled her eyes at the time. A shack in the woods, she called it. That's what you get for being his favorite. She and my uncle had split his savings, which wasn't much. Nobody wanted to fight over the cabin. Brandon had never wanted to go there. He said it was too far from anything, too old, too quiet. At the hearing, when the judge said the cabin stayed with me, he laughed under his breath. A cabin worth nothing. That was my grand prize. But now it was all I had. So that's how I ended up here. Driving 4 hours north with everything I owned in 2 suitcases, pulling into a gravel driveway that was more weeds than gravel, standing in front of a door I couldn't open. I found a rock by the woodpile. It took 6 hits to break the padlock. The door swung open and the smell hit me. Pine, dust, and something underneath that I recognized immediately. Cedar. Grandpa Arthur kept cedar blocks in every drawer and closet. He said it kept the moths away, but I think he just liked the smell. I stepped inside. The flashlight beam swept across the room. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. The plaid couch with the sunken middle cushion. The bookshelf he built himself, still full of paperbacks with cracked spines. The kitchen table where we used to play cards. Him, me, and a cup of hot chocolate that he always made too sweet. The paintings were still on the walls. He'd painted them all himself. Landscapes mostly. The lake at sunrise, the birch trees in autumn, the old stone bridge 2 miles up the road. They weren't masterpieces. They were his. I set my suitcases down, sat on the couch, and something cracked inside me. Not the dramatic kind you see in movies. More like a sound you hear in an old house at night. Something settling, shifting, finding a new position. I cried for 3 hours. Then I found the fuse box, flipped the breakers, and the kitchen light flickered on. The cabin was cold, dusty, and mine. It was the only thing in the world that was still mine. The first week was survival. Not the romantic kind. Not the woman finds herself in nature kind. The ugly kind. The kind where you scrub mold off bathroom tiles at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep and you need something to do with your hands. The cabin had no heat. The water heater took 20 minutes to produce anything above lukewarm. The nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive on a road with no cell signal for the first 15 miles. I ate canned soup for 4 days straight because I was afraid to spend what little money I had. I called my mother on the 3rd day. She picked up on the 6th ring. I heard about the divorce, she said. No question about how I was doing. No offer to help. Just a statement, like she was confirming a weather report. I'm at Grandpa's cabin. Silence. Then, why? Because I don't have anywhere else. You could come stay with your brother for a while. He has that spare room. My brother Kyle hadn't called me in 8 months. The spare room she was talking about was his home office. I would have been sleeping on an air mattress between his desk and his rowing machine. I'm okay here, I said. Well, another pause. Your grandfather always did baby you. I hung up. The days blurred together. I cleaned. I fixed what I could. The leaking faucet in the bathroom, the broken latch on the back door, the window in the bedroom that wouldn't close all the way. Grandpa Arthur had kept a toolbox under the kitchen sink, everything organized and labeled in his handwriting. Phillips head, flathead, 3/8 wrench, each tool in its place, like he expected someone would need them eventually. By the 5th day, I started going through his things. Not to throw them away, I wasn't ready for that, just to touch them. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his fishing vest on the hook by the door, a stack of letters in the desk drawer, most of them from me. Birthday cards, Christmas cards, a few actual letters I'd written during college. He'd kept every single one. On the 6th day, I started cleaning the walls. I wiped down the bookshelves, the windowsills, the frames of his paintings. There were 9 of them throughout the cabin. The lake at sunset, the birch grove, the stone bridge, a deer at the edge of the clearing. Each one signed in the bottom corner with his initials, A.H. I stopped in front of the one above the fireplace. It was the largest, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. A winter scene. The lake frozen over, the trees bare, the sky that particular shade of gray that means snow is coming. I'd always loved this one. When I was little, I told him it looked cold, and he'd said, "That's because I painted it on the coldest night of my life." I reached up to wipe the frame, and the painting shifted. It was heavier than it looked. I steadied it with both hands and felt something behind it. Not the wall. Something between the canvas and the wall. I lifted the painting off the hook carefully and set it against the couch. There was a rectangular shape taped to the back of the frame. Brown packing tape, yellowed with age, holding a manila envelope flat against the wood. My name was written on it in his handwriting. Not Claire, my full name. Claire Elizabeth Ashford. Underneath my name, in smaller letters, "If you're reading this, it's because I'm already gone." My hands were shaking. I peeled the tape slowly, trying not to tear whatever was inside. The envelope was sealed. I could feel something inside. Paper, and something small and hard. A key, maybe. I sat on the floor with it in my lap for a long time. The cabin was quiet. The lake was quiet. Everything was waiting. I opened it. Inside, a single folded letter, a brass key, and a business card for a man named Thomas Wilder, attorney at law, with an address in town, the same small town 20 miles down the road where I'd been buying canned soup. The letter was 1 page, both sides, in his handwriting. I read the first line. "My dear Claire, if you are reading this in the cabin, then you came back to the only place I could leave something for you that no one else would ever look." I read the letter 7 times. I sat on that floor with my back against the couch and read it until I could close my eyes and see his handwriting on the inside of my eyelids. It wasn't long. Grandpa Arthur was never a man who used 10 words when 4 would do, but every sentence carried weight. "I have watched you give yourself away to people who did not know your value. I watched it with your mother. I watched it with the man you married. I could not stop it. That was the hardest part of loving you, knowing that you would have to learn the hard way what you were worth." He wrote about the cabin, how he'd bought it in 1974 for $12,000 with money he'd saved working at the paper mill, how everyone told him it was a waste, too far from town, no resale value, bad investment, how he didn't care because the first time he stood on that porch and looked at the lake, he felt something he couldn't explain. Then the letter changed. The tone shifted. He wrote about the key. "The key opens a safety deposit box at First Heritage Bank on Main Street in Millbrook, box 1177. Thomas Wilder knows everything. He is the only person I trusted with this, and I am trusting you to go see him. Do not tell your mother. Do not tell your uncle. Do not tell anyone until you understand the full picture. The last paragraph. I was not a rich man, Claire, but I was a patient one. Patience and time can build things that money alone cannot. What is in that box is not a gift. It is a correction. The world took things from you that it should not have taken. This is my way of putting them back. He signed it the way he signed his paintings. Just his initials. A.H. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed he used to sleep in, staring at the ceiling, holding the brass key in my fist so tight that it left an impression in my palm. A patient man. That's what he called himself. Not rich. Patient. The next morning, I drove to Millbrook. It took 22 minutes. Main Street was 4 blocks long. A hardware store, a diner, a post office, and there it was. First Heritage Bank. A stone building that looked like it had been there since before the town had a name. I walked in with the key in my jacket pocket and the business card in my hand. The woman at the front desk looked at me the way small-town bank employees look at strangers. Polite, but already cataloging. I'm looking for a safety deposit box, I said. Box 1177. She blinked. You'll need to speak with our manager. Can I have your name? Claire Ashford. Something changed in her face. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. Like she'd been expecting this name, but not this face. One moment, please. The manager came out. A man in his 60s, silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked at me for a long moment. Arthur's granddaughter, he said. Not a question. Yes. He told me you'd come eventually. I just didn't know when. He extended his hand. I'm Gerald. I've been managing this branch for 31 years. Your grandfather was one of our oldest clients. He led me downstairs. The safety deposit vault was in the basement, cool, quiet, lined with metal. Box 1177 was in the 3rd row, bottom shelf. Gerald handed me a second key, the bank's copy, and together we turned both locks. The box was larger than I expected. Inside, a thick folder, a second sealed envelope, and a small leather journal with a rubber band around it. I'll give you some privacy, Gerald said. He paused at the door. For what it's worth, he talked about you every time he came in. Every single time. I opened the folder first. The top document was a deed. Then another deed. Then another. 7 deeds total, each one for a different parcel of land, all of them surrounding the lake. 243 acres, purchased over a span of 37 years, starting in 1978. My grandfather, the man who lived in a 1-bedroom cabin and painted landscapes and drove a truck older than me, had quietly bought every piece of land around the lake. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone you thought you knew? Tell me in the comments, because I was about to find out how wrong I'd been about the man who raised me. The journal was the key to everything. I sat in a small conference room that Gerald let me use, and I read it cover to cover. It wasn't a diary. Grandpa Arthur wasn't the type. It was a ledger. Dates, amounts, parcel numbers, notes. Every purchase documented in his careful handwriting. 1978, 40 acres north of the lake, $8,200. Farmer needed cash for his daughter's surgery. Fair price. Good land. 1983, 22 acres east of the access road, $11,400. Bank was going to foreclose. Bought it before they could. The family doesn't know it was me. 1991, 35 acres including the ridge, $27,000. Used the timber sale money from the north parcel. Replanted everything. He never borrowed. Never took a loan. Every purchase was cash. Saved from decades of work at the paper mill, from selling firewood, from small timber operations on the land he already owned. He'd buy a parcel, manage it, use the income from one piece to buy the next. Patient, methodical, invisible. The second envelope contained a letter from Thomas Wilder, dated the year my grandfather died. It was a legal summary of everything. The trust, the holdings, the current assessments. I read the number 3 times. Then I set the paper down and pressed my palms flat on the table because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. 243 acres of lakefront property in a region that had seen explosive development in the last decade. The assessed value at the time of my grandfather's death, $4.2 million. Current estimated market value, according to a note Thomas Wilder had appended, between $7 and $9 million, depending on how the parcels were sold. My grandfather left me $9 million in land, and nobody knew. Not my mother, not my uncle, not Brandon, not the judge who gave everything to my ex-husband because I had no assets and no income. Nobody. And there was a reason for that. All deeds were held under the trust's name, Hawkins Land Trust, not under my grandfather's personal name. Annual property taxes were paid directly by the trust. To anyone searching public records, the land belonged to an entity. Nobody would connect it to old Arthur from the cabin by the lake. I went back to the table and opened the journal to the last entry. 2019, the year before he died. No purchase this time. Just a note. Claire's husband does not love her. He loves what she gives him. There is a difference, and she will learn it. When she does, she'll come to the cabin. And when she comes to the cabin, she'll find this. That is why I never sold. That is why I never told her. Some things can only be received when you're ready to carry them. I sat on the porch for a long time. The lake was flat, the sky was gray, and the trees on the far shore were starting to turn. All that land, every hill, every tree line, every stretch of shoreline I could see, and most of what I couldn't, belonged to me. Grandpa Arthur had spent 37 years wrapping that lake in a quiet fortress, and he'd put me inside it. The next morning, I called Thomas Wilder. His office was above the hardware store on Main Street. One room, a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets that went floor to ceiling. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man who wore a tie even when nobody was coming in. "I've been waiting for this call for 3 years," he said. "Sit down. We have a lot to talk about." He explained the trust. My grandfather had set it up in 2005, 14 years before he died. The trust held all 7 parcels. I was the sole beneficiary. The terms were simple. The trust would transfer to me upon my grandfather's death, but the documents would only be accessible through the safety deposit box. No notification would be sent. No lawyer would come looking for me. I had to find it myself. "He said you'd find it when you needed it most," Thomas said. He was very specific about that. He didn't want you to have it while things were comfortable. He wanted you to have it when things fell apart. "That's a gamble," I said. "What if I never came to the cabin?" Thomas leaned back in his chair. "He knew you'd come. He told me, 'She'll come. It might take years, but she'll come.' That cabin is the only place she ever felt safe." "There's one more thing," Thomas said. "You're not the only one interested in this land. Lakeview Development Group has been trying to buy parcels around the lake for the past 5 years. They've acquired most of the private land on the west shore, but your grandfather's holdings, the east shore, the north ridge, the access road frontage, they need all of it for their project to work." He slid a letter across the desk. It was from Lakeview Development, addressed to the estate of Arthur Hawkins, dated 14 months ago. The offer was $8.7 million. "Your grandfather never responded," Thomas said. "Neither did I. We were waiting for you. I didn't tell anyone." That first night back in the cabin after meeting Thomas, I made coffee. Real coffee. And I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of me. I read every deed, every assessment, every piece of correspondence from Lakeview Development. And I didn't tell a soul. Not Megan, not my mother, not my brother. The instinct to call someone, to share it, to hear someone gasp and say, "Oh my God, Claire," was strong. But something else was stronger. A quieter voice. The one that sounded like my grandfather. "Do not tell anyone until you understand the full picture." My phone rang the next morning. Brandon's mother, Diane. I let it ring twice. The third time, I picked up. "Claire, honey." Her voice was warm. It was always warm. That was the trap. "I heard you're up at that little cabin of your grandfather's. Brandon mentioned it." "He mentioned it. He's worried about you." I almost laughed. "Almost. Is he? He knows the divorce was hard on you. He feels terrible about how things went." I leaned against the kitchen counter. Through the window, I could see the lake. My lake. The shoreline that curved to the east. My shoreline. The ridge where the pine trees grew thick and dark. My ridge. $9 million of land that her son's lawyer hadn't bothered to look into because it was just a shack in the woods. He was wondering, and this is just a practical thing, nothing emotional, whether you might be willing to sign over the cabin. For tax purposes. His accountant said there might be some complication with the settlement if there's property unaccounted for. I set my coffee down. The mug made a small sound against the counter. "Diane, the cabin was left to me by my grandfather. It wasn't part of the marriage. It wasn't part of the settlement. Of course. He just thought, since it's not worth much and you're living there temporarily." "I'm not living here temporarily." I opened my laptop and found the divorce settlement agreement. Brandon's lawyer had been thorough about claiming everything of value, but the settlement specifically excluded premarital and inherited assets of negligible value. That was the cabin. That one line, negligible value, was the crack in the wall. Because the cabin wasn't what mattered. The trust was what mattered. And the trust was set up in 2005, inherited upon my grandfather's death in 2020, 3 years before the divorce. It was never marital property. Brandon never knew about it. His lawyer never asked. The judge never considered it. 7 parcels, 243 acres. All of it legally and completely mine. I called Thomas Wilder that afternoon. I want to meet with Lakeview Development, I said. Are you sure? Once you engage, things move fast. I'm sure, but I'm not selling. Not yet. I want to hear what they have to say. And Claire, there's something else you should know. Lakeview Development isn't just any company. Their primary investor is a group called Mercer Capital Partners. Their regional director is a man named Scott Kessler. The name didn't mean anything to me. Should I know him? Probably not. But your ex-husband does. Scott Kessler is Brandon's business partner. The kitchen was quiet. The lake was quiet. Even the birds had gone silent, as if the whole world had leaned in to listen. Brandon's business partner was trying to buy my grandfather's land, the same land Brandon had laughed about in court, the same land his mother had just called asking me to sign over. I gripped the edge of the counter. The marble was cold under my palms. Set the meeting, Thomas. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Thomas brought me everything he had on Lakeview Development: corporate filings, project proposals, public records. I spread it all across the kitchen table and worked through it the way my grandfather would have, slowly, carefully, making notes in the margins. Lakeview Development had been assembling land around the lake for a luxury resort project. Golf course, spa, waterfront condominiums, private marina. Total projected investment, $120 million. They'd spent the last 4 years buying parcels on the west and south shores. But the east shore and the north ridge, my grandfather's land, were the linchpin. Without those parcels, they couldn't complete the resort footprint. Without my land, their $120 million project was dead. And Brandon knew. He had to know. I sat with that for a while. I let the anger come, and I let it sit, and then I let it settle into something colder and more useful. On Thursday, I drove to Thomas's office for the meeting. I wore the nicest clothes I'd brought, which wasn't saying much, considering everything I owned fit in 2 suitcases. Scott Kessler arrived at exactly 10 o'clock. He was younger than I expected. Early 40s, tailored suit, the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting what you want. With him was a woman I didn't recognize. Sharp eyes, gray blazer, a leather portfolio under her arm. His attorney. Scott shook my hand and smiled the way people smile when they think they're about to close a deal. Claire, it's a pleasure. I've heard great things about your grandfather's property. From whom? I asked. The smile flickered. He recovered quickly. The land speaks for itself. His attorney laid out the offer. $9.4 million for all 7 parcels. Clean sale, 30-day close, no contingencies. They'd even cover transfer taxes. It was a strong offer. 6 months ago, I would have cried at a number like that. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Tell me about the resort project, I said. He talked about jobs, tax revenue. I cut him off. And how much is the total project worth upon completion? He hesitated. The projected return isn't really relevant to the land valuation. It is to me. Scott cleared his throat. Upon full build-out and sales completion, the project is valued at approximately $340 million. And without my parcels? I'm sorry? Without the East Shore, the North Ridge, and the access road frontage, can the project proceed? The project would need to be significantly restructured. Restructured, meaning it can't happen. I wouldn't say. I would. I opened the folder Thomas had prepared. Your environmental impact study references the East Shore watershed as the primary drainage corridor for the golf course. Your marina permit specifies the North Cove, which is on Parcel 4. And your road access variance depends on frontage that belongs to Parcel 7. Without these 3 elements, you don't have a project. You have an expensive idea. The room was very quiet. Scott's smile was gone. In its place was something more honest, the look of a man who had underestimated the person sitting across from him and was only now realizing it. What are you proposing? He said. I'm not proposing anything. Not today. Today I'm listening. When I'm ready to talk, Thomas will contact you. I stood up, shook his hand, walked out. In the stairwell, I stopped. My hands were trembling. Not from fear, but from something I didn't have a name for. Something that felt like the first deep breath after being underwater for a very long time. Thomas caught up with me on the sidewalk. Your grandfather sat in that same chair, he said quietly. Same room. Same table. 3 different developers came to him over the years. He listened to every one of them. Never raised his voice. Never showed his hand. He told me once, the person who understands the land always wins, because the land doesn't lie and it doesn't leave. I drove back to the cabin, sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the lake. My grandfather's lake. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I hadn't seen in months. Brandon, we need to talk. I didn't answer Brandon's message that night, or the next morning. I left the phone on the kitchen table face down and made coffee. Sat on the porch, looked at the lake, thought about what my grandfather would do. He would wait. So I waited. The second message came the next day. Claire, I'm serious. I need to talk to you. It's about the cabin. The third came 12 hours later. I know you're angry, but this is bigger than both of us. Call me. I didn't call. Instead, I called Thomas. Your grandfather always said, when someone starts texting about something they could handle on the phone, it's because they're afraid to hear the answer. And when they stop texting and show up at the door, it's because they're afraid of getting no answer at all. Brandon showed up on a Saturday morning. I was on the porch with coffee and one of my grandfather's books, an 80s crime novel with a spine so worn the pages were falling out on their own. I heard the car before I saw it. A black SUV parking on the dirt road, the door opening, footsteps on gravel. He stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He was different. Not his face. His face was the same face that made me believe for 12 years. But the way he held his body, tense, calculated, the posture of someone who'd rehearsed what he was going to say. Can I come up? He asked. The porch is mine, so it's up to me. He came up, sat in the rocking chair my grandfather made by hand. Are you okay? He said. I didn't answer. Took a sip of coffee. Waited. Look, I know things got ugly. The lawyers, the process, that whole circus. I didn't want it to go that way. But it did. It did. And I'm sorry. He wasn't sorry. I could see it in his shoulders. Too rigid for someone actually apologizing. People who are truly sorry soften. He was hard as concrete. What do you want, Brandon? Fine. I'll be direct. I know about the development project at the lake. I know Lakeview wants this land, and I know you met with them. How do you know that? He hesitated. Just an instant. Too quick for most people to notice. But I was married to this man for 12 years. I knew every micro-expression. That hesitation meant he was about to lie. Scott told me. We're friends. He mentioned he met the landowner and the name was Ashford. Friends, not partners. Friends. He chose that word carefully. So this is a real opportunity, Claire. We're talking about millions. And I think we can work this out in a way that benefits both of us. I set the coffee on the wooden table my grandfather had sanded by hand. The sound of the mug against the wood was dry and final. Brandon, you got the house, the cars, the accounts, the retirement fund, everything I helped build over 12 years. And now you show up on the porch of a cabin you called a shack and offer me help. You're trying to get into a deal you have no part in. Because you know that without this land, your partner's project doesn't exist. His face changed. The mask dropped for half a second. And what was underneath wasn't anger, wasn't surprise. It was fear. Pure, simple, financial fear. Scott Kessler isn't your friend, I said. He's your business partner at Mercer Capital Partners. I know that. Thomas Wielder knows that. And now you know I know. He stood frozen. My grandfather's rocking chair creaked in the silence. Leave, Brandon. He stood up, opened his mouth, closed it, walked down the stairs. Halfway to the car, he stopped and turned. You don't know what you're getting into, he said. This deal is bigger than you think. I know exactly how big it is. $340 million full build-out. I read the prospectus. He went white, got in the car, drove down the dirt road without looking back. What would you have done? Tell me. If it were you on that porch, would you have let him in? Leave in the comments what you think should happen next. The day after Brandon showed up, I knocked on the door of a house about half a mile from the cabin along the trail that ran beside the lake. A white house with green shutters and a garden that still had color even in late autumn. The woman who opened the door was in her early 60s, short gray hair, hands that belonged to someone who worked the soil. She looked at me for a moment and before I could say anything said, You're Claire. How do you know? Because you look just like Arthur when he was young, and because he told me you'd show up one day. She opened the door wide. Come in. The coffee just finished. Her name was Ruth. She'd lived in that house for 28 years. She and my grandfather were neighbors, friends, and, I would slowly discover, accomplices in a way I hadn't expected. Her kitchen was warm. It smelled like cinnamon and burning wood. He talked about you all the time, Ruth said. Not in a sentimental way, he wasn't like that. More like someone describing a plan. Claire is smart, but she trusts too easily. She's going to need to learn. When she does, I need to be ready. Ready for what? Ruth looked at me over the rim of her mug. To leave everything to you without anyone getting in the way. She told me things I didn't know. That my grandfather had known about developer interest in the lake since the early 2000s. That he'd refused every offer without hesitating. He used to say that land was the one thing nobody could take from you in court, Ruth said. Money disappears. Marital property gets divided. But inherited land, protected in a trust, that's yours and nobody else's. Ruth, I need to ask you something and I need you to be honest. I'm always honest. It's my worst quality. My ex-husband, Brandon, did he come here before? Before the divorce? Ruth stopped the mug halfway to her mouth, set it back on the table slowly. Once. About 5, 6 years ago. You weren't with him. He showed up alone, in a nice car, walked the road, looked at the property, knocked on my door asking about the land around the lake. 5, 6 years ago. Before my grandfather even died. Before the divorce. He pushed, asked specifically about Arthur's land, how many acres, if there were any environmental restrictions. I told him to talk to the owner. He said the owner was his wife's grandfather and the old man was difficult to deal with. Difficult to deal with. My grandfather, who never raised his voice in his life. Difficult to deal with because he wouldn't sell what he didn't want to sell. After he left, Ruth continued, I called Arthur and told him. You know what he said? It started. Just that. It started. And the next week he went to Thomas's office and made the final changes to the trust. I understood. All at once. Brandon didn't file for divorce because he didn't love me anymore. He filed because he needed me out of the equation. He figured that if he took everything and left me with nothing, I'd sell the cabin and the land out of desperation. And then Lakeview would buy it from me for a fraction of what it was worth. My grandfather saw it coming before I did, before anyone, and he closed every door before Brandon could open one. Ruth looked at me firmly. Your grandfather asked me a favor before he died. He asked me to keep an eye on the cabin. If you showed up, to welcome you, but never to come looking for you first. He said you had to come on your own. Why? Because if someone told you, you'd doubt it. If you found it yourself, you'd believe it. I went back to the cabin, opened my grandfather's journal to the 2019 page, read the last entry again. But now I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Below it, in smaller letters, almost faded. If he comes before her, Ruth will know. If she comes before him, the land will take care of the rest. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday. Thomas called me at 8 in the morning. We received a legal notice. Brandon is contesting the trust. I sat down in the kitchen chair. The coffee mug I was holding stopped midair. On what grounds? That the trust should have been disclosed during the divorce proceedings as a potential asset. That by failing to disclose the existence of the trust, you acted in bad faith. He's asking to reopen the case. I didn't even know the trust existed during the divorce. I know. And that's why his argument is weak. But weak doesn't mean it goes away. If a judge agrees to reopen, this could take months, maybe a year. And during that time, any negotiation with Lakeview would be frozen. That's exactly what he wants, I thought. Not to win the case. To buy time. To wear me down. I knew this method. I'd lived with it for 12 years. Brandon never yelled. Never threatened directly. He exhausted you. Drained you. Turned every decision into a maze so tiring that in the end you agreed with him just so you could breathe. Thomas, how much does it cost to defend this? If it goes to court, between $40,000 and $80,000. I have $11,000 in my account. And the land? As long as there's an open legal dispute over the trust, the land is frozen. It can't be used as collateral. It can't be negotiated. It can't generate income. No bank will accept it as security with pending litigation. $9 million in land and I couldn't touch a cent of it. Brandon knew that. That was the point. Make me sit on a fortune I couldn't access until I gave in. But I wasn't sitting in the old Claire. I was sitting in my grandfather's kitchen chair, looking through his window, surrounded by his land. And the land doesn't lie. And it doesn't leave. I opened my grandfather's journal again. This time I went to the beginning. Read every entry, every note. He was a meticulous man. A man who had planned for 37 years. A man who predicted Brandon would show up before I did. Did he predict this too? Page 47. A note different from the others. No purchase date, no amount. Just an instruction. If there is a legal challenge to the trust, Thomas has Protocol B in the gray filing cabinet, 3rd drawer, green folder. I paid for the best. You won't need to pay again. My grandfather had hired preemptive legal protection. I called Thomas. Protocol B, gray filing cabinet, 3rd drawer, green folder. Silence on the other end. Then a quiet laugh. Not humor, admiration. I'd forgotten, he said. Your grandfather had me prepare that in 2018. A complete preemptive defense package. Independent legal opinions confirming the legal separation of assets. Notarized declarations that the beneficiary had no knowledge of the trust. A letter from Arthur himself explaining why the trust was kept confidential. Will it hold? Claire, your grandfather paid 3 different lawyers to review this. 1 in New York, 1 in Boston, 1 here. All 3 signed off. It's airtight. I held the phone with both hands. The pendulum clock kept ticking. Send the response to Brandon's lawyer. Use everything. Gladly. My grandfather didn't just buy the land. He didn't just set up the trust. He built a legal wall around everything and left me the key. Patient, methodical, invisible. He knew they would try, and he made sure they couldn't succeed. Brandon's lawyer withdrew the challenge 11 days later. Thomas called me with the news in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. I was on the porch painting. That deserves an explanation. 3 days after the legal letter arrived, while I was waiting for the response, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I went to the corner of my grandfather's bedroom where he kept his supplies: brushes, oil paints, 2 wooden easels, blank canvases leaning against the wall. Everything covered in dust. Everything waiting. I can't paint. Never could. As a kid, I smeared color on paper while my grandfather made landscapes that looked real. He never corrected me. He just said, "Paint what you see, not what you think you should see." I set up his easel on the porch, opened the paints, and I started painting the lake. It was terrible. It didn't matter. They withdrew everything. Protocol B worked. Brandon's lawyer didn't even try to respond, just filed to dismiss. I set the brush down. Blue paint dripped onto the wooden porch floor. What does that mean? It means the trust is yours. No dispute, no conditions. Nobody can take it. And Lakeview? They called again. 3 times this week. Scott Kessler is getting anxious. The project deadlines are tightening. Based on public filings, the financing approval expires in 6 months. If they don't close the land acquisition by then, they lose their investors. 6 months. My grandfather taught me about patience. But he also taught me that patience isn't about waiting. It's about knowing what you're waiting for. I knew what I was waiting for. That night, I drew up a plan. Not a revenge plan. A plan for what I wanted my life to be from that moment forward. I didn't want to sell the land. My grandfather spent 37 years building it. Selling it would erase every decision he made. But 243 acres of unused land didn't pay bills. On the last page of the journal, there was a line I'd read before, but hadn't understood. Land is power. But power is not selling. Power is deciding who uses it, how they use it, and for how long. A lease, not a sale. I would keep every acre. Every deed would stay in my name, and Lakeview would pay for the right to use, not to own. A 60-year contract with review every decade. Guaranteed annual income. Full control. I called Thomas. I have a proposal, but I need you to tell me if it's legally possible. He listened, asked questions, was quiet for almost a minute. It's possible, and it's exactly what your grandfather would have done. He paused. But Claire, I need to ask you something. Not as your lawyer, but as someone who knew your grandfather his whole life. Are you sure you don't want to sell and walk away? Start clean somewhere else? $9 million would give you a lifetime without worry. I looked through the window. The lake was dark. The stars were coming out. My grandfather had 37 years to sell and leave. He never did. Thomas was quiet. Then he said softly, "All right, let's build the lease." The meeting was at Thomas's office on a Wednesday morning. It had rained all night and the air smelled like washed earth and pine needles. I drove the road that ran along the lake, and for the first time I looked at that landscape not as a lost woman who ended up here because she had nowhere else. I looked at it as the owner. Scott Kessler brought a team this time. His attorney, a financial analyst, and a man I didn't recognize. Older, completely white hair, a suit that cost more than everything I had in my 2 suitcases. He was the investment director of Mercer Capital. The big money. Thomas and I sat on one side of the table. They sat on the other. 4 against 2. But I had something they didn't. I had the land. "Thank you for coming," I said. "I'll be direct. I'm not selling. You refused an offer of $9.4 million. We can renegotiate the price. It's not about the price. The land is not for sale. Not a single lot. Not a single acre. At any price." "Then why are we here?" Scott said. "Because I have an alternative proposal. Long-term lease. 60 years with a review clause every decade. Lakeview receives the right to use all 7 parcels. I retain full ownership of the land." I passed the pages across the table. Thomas explained the terms. The white-haired man read every page. No expression. "This is highly unusual," he said finally. My grandfather was an unusual man. Investors prefer outright acquisition. A lease creates complexity. Complexity for you, security for me. You understand that if you refuse to sell and we don't accept the lease, the project simply moves to another location? With all due respect, you have $48 million invested in land on the west and south shores that only has value if the project is here. You're not going anywhere else. You can't. Everyone at this table knows it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. A short, contained, genuine laugh. Your grandfather knew how to pick his heirs. The office door opened. Everyone turned. Brandon. He walked in as if he had every right to be there. Dark blue suit, tie, the same posture he used to impress clients. But I saw his eyes. Quick, nervous, scanning the room. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, as if he'd been invited. "You were not called to this meeting," Thomas said, standing. "I'm a director at Mercer Capital. I have every right—" "You're my ex-husband," I said. The entire room went still. "And you tried to legally challenge the trust that protects this land, which gives you exactly zero right to sit at this table." Brandon looked at me, and I held it. No anger, no trembling, nothing. "Claire, Scott can represent Mercer. You can't. Leave." Scott looked at the white-haired man. The white-haired man looked at Brandon, and with the smallest gesture, barely perceptible, he shook his head. Brandon stood frozen for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. "Where were we?" I said. The white-haired man looked at me. "The lease. I'll take it to the investors. I'll call in a week." 2 weeks, I said. "I'm busy." The call came in 12 days. They accepted. Thomas told me the details on a late afternoon, sitting on the cabin porch. I made coffee for both of us, the way my grandfather used to make it, too strong and too sweet. Thomas held the mug with both hands and looked at the lake. The lease agreement was approved by Mercer Capital's board. 60 years. Review every decade. Fixed annual revenue of $680,000 plus 2.3% of the resort's gross revenue. The environmental clause stayed intact. The reversion clause stayed intact. You keep every deed. "There's one more thing," Thomas said. "Scott Kessler told me Brandon was let go from Mercer Capital last week. Conflict of interest. The attempt to challenge the trust while the company was negotiating was the final straw." I didn't say anything. I looked at the lake. The water was calm. The sun was dropping behind the trees on the North Ridge. The ridge my grandfather bought in 1991 with money from timber he cut and replanted himself. "You're not going to ask how he's doing?" Thomas said. "No." Thomas nodded. Took a sip of coffee. Didn't ask again. I signed the contract on a Friday morning in Thomas's office. No photographers, no party, no champagne. 7 deeds, 1 lease agreement, my name on every page. The white-haired man, Richard Hale, shook my hand and said, "If you ever want to invest, look me up." "Thank you," I said. "But my grandfather taught me to invest in land. I'll stick with what I know." I drove back to the cabin, parked, sat on the porch. It was real autumn now. The trees were red and gold. The lake reflected everything, the colors, the clouds, the dark pines at the top of the ridge. I went inside, grabbed the easel, carried it to the porch, set up a blank canvas, opened the paints, the same ones he used, and I started painting the lake. It was terrible, out of proportion. The trees looked like fat broccoli. The color of the sky wasn't remotely close to that orange tone I was trying to capture. It didn't matter. I signed it in the bottom corner. Not with his initials, with mine. C.A. Claire Ashford. I hung it on the wall next to his 9 paintings. The 10th, the worst of them all. And somehow, the one that made the most sense there. I called Megan that night. "Thank you," I said. "For the couch, for the borrowed car, for reminding me the cabin existed. Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay." I sat on the porch until it got dark. The lake disappeared little by little. First the colors, then the shapes, then everything. All that was left was the sound of water lapping against my grandfather's dock. Patience isn't about waiting. It's about knowing what you're waiting for. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever started over from zero, if someone ever underestimated what you were worth, if someone once left you something that only made sense when everything fell apart, subscribe. Because this is just one of the stories I have to tell, and the next ones will surprise you.